Another important character to consider in these stories is the handsome prince, love interest. Strangely enough, love interests don't really play a big role in these fairy tales. In fact, in the case of Snow White, we don't even meet the guy until the end. And even then, he's just a guy who happened to be around. He doesn't even kiss Snow White or anything like that. The dwarves drop the coffin, the piece of apple pops out of her throat, she wakes up, sees the prince, and then they decide to marry. Snow White's prince is introduced at the beginning, being attracted by Snow White's warbly voice, though one wonders why. And they at least establish that first love-at-first-sight connection that Disney does oh so well.
The Sleeping Beauty prince is a bit more substantial, though, again, there's no meeting beforehand. Basically, he hears about the Sleeping Kingdom and decides, because he's an overly macho egotist, that he's going to go rescue the princess, despite the fact that others have literally died trying. So what makes him so special? Who knows? The Briars just kind of part for him. No need to do any work at all. At least Prince Philip fought for his princess. He's got that going for him.
And then there's Cinderella's Prince Charming. Yeah, sorry, I got nothing. He's in 2 scenes, says about 3 lines, and sings a duet with Cinderella. And that's it. He's mostly just there as a prize, a character that everybody talks about rather than someone we actually get to know. Hell, he doesn't even go search for the girl that fits the slipper. It's not even his idea! In fact, when it comes right down to it, the king is the real love interest of this story. I mean, he might not want Cinderella necessarily, but he wants his daughter to get married, and he wants grandchildren, and he sees Cinderella as the most viable candidate, so he's the one that makes all the plans to go after her. In short, the princes in the books may not be a big part of the story, but the princes in the movies are just boring, and yet they take up so much screen time. And you may well ask, why would such a nice young girl fall in love with such a boring individual?
Why do these girls fall in love with completely uninteresting men? It makes me think that it's not love, but merely infatuation. They met the princess just once and thought it was love at first sight, but they never spent any more time together. Now something about this just doesn't seem right. At least in the books, the idea of romance isn't something they're thinking of. But Disney shows us just one little meeting, and suddenly it's love. Snow White had a moment, Cinderella a dance, Aurora had a creepy meeting. At least the post-Renaissance films showed us love beyond first greeting. Aladdin and even Ariel had some time to get to know the object of their affection. And Belle and Rapunzel did not trust their men, and they had to work to make a connection. But these 3 think they found true love with one sappy invitation. So let's call it what it is. Not love, but simple infatuation.
So while the movie princes may have gotten more time than the book princess, this is actually detrimental to the story as they have absolutely no interesting characteristics. You can tell with Prince Philip at least that they're at least trying to create some interesting characterization, but they don't pull it off. Later Disney films would do this far more successfully. Prince Eric was the first Disney prince that actually had his own problems to solve, other than how do I get this girl to marry me, and the Beast, Jasmine, and Flynn actually have their own character arc that parallels the protagonists. But for the first 3, the skimpy showing in the books is better than the drawn-out boredom of the movies. But if there's one thing that Disney knows how to do, it's introducing us to wonderful side characters. So here's to the sidekicks, comic reliefs, and animal friends. Let's face it, the early Disney films were basically about the side characters, weren't they? I mean, it's not like the main protagonists were that interesting, right? Right? I'm going to assume those questions are rhetorical and move on. Most of these fairy tales really do focus on the drama between the main character and the antagonist, though it's important to point out that the side characters still get more time than the love interest. The 7 dwarves in the original Snow White story were, well, not altogether different from their movie counterparts. They were in the mines all day, they couldn't cook for themselves, and they needed a person like Snow White to basically take care of them. The dwarves in the movie are basically why the movie's memorable at all. They weren't just 7 anonymous dwarves. They were given names and personalities. In fact, their names are their personalities. When it comes right down to it, this is their story. Snow White is so incredibly dull that these guys, with their hydrophobic antics, are infinitely more interesting and pretty much carry the film.
Sleeping Beauty is pretty much the same story. In the movie, the other characters basically consist of the good fairies and the king and queen. Now, we've already talked about the horrible parenting practices of these two, so we won't get into that. But just like the evil fairy, the good fairies basically give their gifts and leave. The only solution they provide in terms of helping to solve the problem is to put the sleeping spell on her, which isn't really that much of a solution, and to help preserve the kingdom for her until she wakes. Also, just like Snow White, this movie's story really belongs to the side characters. The 3 fairies, Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather, and the 2 kings, who together provide much of the comedy for the story. And in this case, the fairies actually come up with a much better plan for protecting the princess. They hide her as a peasant in the woods and forsake magic to avoid attracting Maleficent's attention. Of course they blow it in the end, but after 16 years of not using magic, can you really blame them? Honestly, you kind of have to admire the sacrifices made, both by the fairies in giving up magic and by the king and queen in giving up their daughter. If they'd focused on that more, this probably would have been a much more successful movie. Easily the most mind-numbingly boring scene in this film is the one where Aurora features on her own. The fairies, once again, carry this movie.
In the book, Cinderella doesn't feature a lot of other characters other than the ones that we already mentioned. The only real exception is the fairy godmother, who basically just appears, casts her spells, warns Cinderella to be home by midnight, and leaves. Unlike Snow White and Sleeping Beauty, which basically feature protagonists that do very little, Cinderella's story is actually a little bit harder, because she's basically a slave who rises above the ashes of her old life to find a new one. That's why Cinderella is so much more popular and prolific than the other fairy tales. It's a story that we all wish for. And the movie Cinderella is, as we've already said, a much more interesting princess than the other 2. But Disney still made sure that there were interesting side characters, and in this case we have talking mice. Of the first 3 films, this is the only one where the animal friends actually talk. We had Snow White's animal friends helping her clean house, and we had Aurora's animal friends dressing up as a prince and dancing with her, okay. But in this one, the mice actually speak, and good grief are their voices annoying. Honestly though, that's my only problem with the mice. Their personalities are very enjoyable. I especially love the Abbott and Costello style relationship between Jack and Gus. And they demonstrate great loyalty to Cinderella by lugging this huge key up all these stairs. Good grief. Though that does beg the question, where were all the other mice? You know, the mice that helped make a freaking dress? Wouldn't this have gone a lot faster if they'd helped? Also, we have this scene.
And I can do the sewing. Leave the sewing to the women.
Oh, great, perfect. You know, it's because of people like you that we have overly macho males trying to compensate for insecurities that they feel because enjoying domestic or artistic activities isn't manly enough. Let Jack sew! Anyway... Sorry. Other characters in the movie include the king and the duke, who basically carry out the prince's storyline for him. The king sends the duke out to find the girl who fits the glass slipper. The prince isn't even a part of it. And... yeah, these two are freaking hilarious together. The relationship between them, with the king's angry bluster and the duke's attempts to reason with him, is just classic. And of course we have Lucifer, the obligatory bad guy animal friend, who is the only bad guy to actually die in this movie. Or so we assume. But the sidekick trend didn't stop with these 3 films, and to tell us about the films after the Renaissance, here's background singer number 3. That the rhubarb grows better if it's time traveling, so it makes sense to put it in the... Oh, hey guys! I just came to the CMA to get internet, but look who I happened to run into on Skype.
Hey guys.
Various greetings! Alicia, what are you doing here?
Well, you've been working on that musical so much that you barely talked to me, so number 3 said that he would, and we're going to talk about sidekicks.
Disney demonstrated an affinity for comic relief sidekicks early on, and the trend continued into the Renaissance. Ariel got not one, not two, but 3 sidekicks who were also comedic and animal friends. Even Ursula got animal friends.
And as you might have noticed already, these adaptations fall into certain patterns. And for the side characters, the pattern is comedy and giving human traits to non-humans, or animal friends. Beauty and the Beast took a more creative approach to their side characters. In this case, the human traits are given to household objects in Beast's castle, but that's because they are actually humans. Rather than an empty house that is itself a servant of the Beast, we have servants turning into household items, like clocks, candelabras, and teapots. This, of course, is funny, but they never lose track of the humanity these characters possess either.
Aladdin has an animal friend for each of the 3 main characters. Abu for Aladdin, Raja for Jasmine, and Iago for Jafar. And the Sultan also provides a fair bit of comedy in his bumbling sort of way. And for Tangled, we have quite possibly the most pointless sidekick, Pascal, the chameleon, who really does nothing except change color. But they make up for it for the inclusion of Maximilian, the bloodhound horse, and by God is this character hilarious. I freaking love this horse.
So, even though they didn't actually need to carry the story in the later movies like they did in the older ones, they still played a significant role and provided a lot of laughs.
Ah, sidekicks. What would we do without you? Really? Another one?
What would we do without the guy who takes all the lumps? What would we do without best friends and henchmen and chumps? What would we do without cute little animals who always give us a smile? We may actually have to focus on the protagonists a while.
Not that. What would we do without these fools to laugh it up with? Characters whose billing is only about 4th or 5th.
Without this cuteness and comic relief, we simply could not abide. So Disney, we thank you that you provide.
Why is there dancing? I think the real question to be asking is, why wasn't there dancing before this? That really doesn't answer the question. It's a musical, Jeffrey. There has to be dance numbers. Okay, but I mean, they're not even in the same room. Come on, you don't have to be in the same room to dance together. No, I'm pretty sure you do. You know what? I'm gonna join them for the kick line. Is the kick line?
What would we do without someone to make us all laugh? Without someone to move the plot forward with some major gaffe? With main characters so horribly dull, it's a wonder that we notice them at all. Without the sidekicks, these movies would be in the pit. Would be in the pit. Without the sidekicks, we wouldn't watch it. We wouldn't watch it. We wouldn't watch it. Every character could use a sidekick.
But let's face it, stories like these don't make for good feature-length films unless you get a little creative with the composition. Thus far, we've seen some pretty consistent patterns in the way that Disney adapts fairy tales. They polarize the goodness and the badness of our good guys and bad guys, they emphasize love interests, and the comedic possibilities of some of the side characters. Essentially, they try to take these relatively simple stories and make them in some way more cinematically interesting. Which, come to think of it, is pretty much what all movie adaptations of books do. And something else that we see from Disney quite a lot is subplots. Take Cinderella, for example. Now, the original story doesn't have a lot of deviation. It's the straight-up rags-to-riches Cinderella story that we all know and love. It doesn't take much longer than 15-20 minutes tops to tell, so how do we pad this out to a full-length movie? Well, the side characters help. We get to see the comic interactions between the king and the duke, as well as, God help us, the singing mice. In particular, we have the character of Gus, who basically gets an entire subplot devoted entirely to him as he is introduced to the world of the mice in Cinderella's house, especially in dealing with the cat, Lucifer. So several minutes of the film involve a subplot where Lucifer specifically singles him out, and Gus, along with Jack's help, attempts to outsmart him. And it does succeed in making the story marginally more involved as we get to see some of the behind-the-scenes stuff with the typical Cinderella story.
Snow White is another story that's told simply. Vain Queen wants to kill innocent girl uses her winsome ways to escape and hide with dwarves, Queen tries to kill girl, almost succeeds, but dwarves are always able to undo death. Snow White marries Prince, who happens to be riding by, and they all live happily ever after. It's not the world's strongest story, I'll grant you, but it's very simple and straightforward. Like this review should be. Oh, Jeffrey, why must you always suck the fun out of everything? Look, I didn't even want to do this review in the first place, and now I'm stuck talking about Snow White. This isn't exactly fun for me. That's because you're simply not embracing all the musical goodness that this review has to offer. Take a cue from Disney's Snow White. Here we have a relatively bland and uninteresting story saved by subplots. Like this one, where the dwarves don't want to wash up for dinner.
Don't be nervous.
Or this one, where the dwarves decide to dance with Snow White by standing on top of each other. None of which has anything to do with anything. Look, these stories were supposed to be simple and straightforward. These subplots aren't doing anything but padding.
Oh, you want to talk about padding? Let's look at Sleeping Beauty. Another relatively simple story. Girl is cursed to die, then cursed to just sleep for a long time. Things come to pass exactly as predicted, and then she's rescued. As it is, this movie is already really short, just 75 minutes. And they still feel the need to pad it out, not only with the antics of the fairies and Maleficent, but also with the antics of the two kings. But here's the thing, those are the only interesting aspects of the movie. The main plot is just plain dull, almost as dull as the characters involved in it. The only thing that even remotely saves this movie is the subplots. The interactions of the fairies, the drama of Aurora being separated from her parents to live as a peasant in the hopes of saving her. Which would be great if they actually did it right. But of the three original fairy tale films, this one is the worst, and there's a reason. The subplots, quite simply, should have been the main plots. The main plot was so unbelievably boring that we found ourselves wishing for more scenes with the fairies. They were the characters who actually had personalities. So, you're saying the subplots saved the film? No, I'm saying that the subplots made us see how the film could have been saved. The early fairy tale movies are actually a lot like early musicals, where songs and dance were just thrown in for no particular reason. Are they entertaining? Sure, sometimes more entertaining than the main storyline. But they don't move the story forward or contribute to it in any way. And they distract from what should be a pretty straightforward telling of a simple story. Wait, what?
Why is there a song here? This isn't what I pick. I really didn't say a thing to merit this romantic music. And besides, I hadn't finished yet. I had another point to make. I wish you'd let me. Is this fun? Isn't this entertaining? Don't you love the way our two styles are campaigning for dominance in this song?
It's what I've been saying all along.
Hey, you rhymed. We're making progress.
Shut up! Look, it's like this whole review. And for that matter, it's like this whole reviewing series. Why does this need to be a musical? Why did the last one need to be film noir? Why did there have to be some half-assed storyline stringing the whole season together? And for that matter, why the hell are there seasons? It's the internet!
Exactly my point. This didn't need to be a song. I'm not even reviewing anymore. Why is this necessary? Was editing Matt just getting bored?
Hey, look! Can you blame me? Each review was just the same. First Matt argues cut, then Hatter argues cut, then Matt cut, Hatter cut, Matt cut, Hatter cut, on and on and on, for hours and hours. I needed to provide some interest, so that I wouldn't sour on editing these reviews.
So, wait a minute, hang on. Are you telling me that the whole reason why we're doing a musical, and why the last review was film noir, and why there was this storyline with Cassie trying to take over, and Hatter being sent to Seattle, and me being sent out into the wilderness, all of this is because you were just getting tired of editing the regular reviews? Well, look, you guys have the fun part. I'm the one who has to sit hunched over a computer all day. At least this way I get to have a little fun here and there. Oh, come on! You think it's easy editing a musical? You should try it sometime. I've got a better idea. How about you do a portion of the review? Talk about the composition in the post-Renaissance films. Me? Well, you've been editing the subplots for this entire reviewing series. No one knows about the subject better than you. Besides, if you mess up, you can just edit it out, right? I guess so. Okay. No. That's better. As Disney fairy tale films progressed, the subplots did get better. Snow White's subplot had nothing to do with the main plot, Cinderella's had a little bit to do with it, and Sleeping Beauty's should have just stood alone as the main story. By the time we get to the Disney Renaissance, they're doing subplots right. And they actually use them to better develop the love interest and the side characters. The Little Mermaid showed us Eric's soul searching and his decision of whether he should take what's right in front of him or wait for a dream. As well as King Triton's drama of having to deal with the brat like Ariel. Beauty and the Beast gave us the Beast development alongside of Belle's, as well as the drama of the household staff and Gaston's plan for marrying Belle. And Aladdin shows us Jasmine's desire to marry whomever she chooses. Tangled probably handled subplots the best, completely rewriting the backstory of Rapunzel and allowing that to really drive the movie. Tangled, or as I like to call it, Sleeping Beauty done right, gave us a lot of explanations for the things in the original Rapunzel story that aren't adequately explained, but we'll talk more about that when we do that actual comparison. In short, subplots exist either to develop another character or in some way supplement the main plot and make it better. And while it could be argued that Cinderella's subplots work towards this, Snow White's subplots really don't have anything to do with the story, and Sleeping Beauty's subplots don't necessarily make the story better. We're just being entertained by the subplots and not really paying attention to the main story.
So while they might make the story more entertaining, they don't make it better necessarily. And the fairy tales are timeless really in their sheer simplicity. So book just barely edges out the movie on this one. What did I just say? But you can't talk about fairy tales and Disney movies without talking about imagery. Along with other characters, the bad guy, and the subplots, another thing that the Sleeping Beauty movie has going for it is imagery. The animation is a departure from the previous two films because Disney wanted this one to stand out. So this film's animation is much more artistic, more like a painting that happened to move than a cartoon. And most of the music in the film is an arrangement or an adaptation of the music from Tchaikovsky's ballet based on this fairy tale. That said, the pattern that Disney follows with these stories is to clean everything up. The fairy tales can quite often get pretty gruesome. The briar patch that surrounds the castle, for instance, is capable of killing those who try to cross it. And did so.
The version of Cinderella that they used, the Charles Perrault version, isn't terribly gruesome. It's certainly not compared to some of the other versions of the story, though it is worth pointing out that despite being named Cinderella, the Disney movie never shows so much as a speck of dust on this character. Come to think of it, they never do explain why she's named Cinderella. Kind of like they never explained why Rapunzel is named Rapunzel in Tangled. The animation in Cinderella, however, is quite impressive. This was hailed as a classic for Disney largely because of how it looks. Everything seems so grand and big, which is perfect for this rags to riches story, which also happens to feature mice. It just looks really good, and the imagery really helps to supplement the story it's trying to tell.
Definitely the most sanitized version of these three movies is Snow White. Perrault, who told the Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella stories, was relatively mild. But the version of Snow White Disney used came from the gore-loving Brothers Grimm. In addition to the whole eating of the heart and liver, at the end of the story, the queen is invited to the wedding of Snow White and the prince. While there, she is punished by being forced to wear red-hot iron shoes and dancing until she dies. Ouch. Disney included none of this, and instead decided to have the evil queen fall off of a cliff. Which, to be fair, is a better ending for kids. And Snow White, of course, is the groundbreaking animated film, and even today it's still considered one of the best films purely on its animation. And even in the light of huge animation studios existing and competing today, it's hard not to be impressed by just how detailed and smooth this animation is. And let's face it, as big as other animation studios get, They all owe a big debt to this movie. It set the bar very high, to say the least, and yet Disney still manages to meet it and surpass it.
Now, one thing that you do notice with Disney animation a lot is that they make it really, really obvious what side everybody's on. We've already talked about this a little bit. The good guys are drawn with these sort of soft lines to make them look aesthetically pleasing, whereas the bad guys are drawn with these really harsh, sharp lines, or they're just made to look really ugly. And it even goes a step further with the comic relief. The comic relief look comical. And so it's a little bit obvious who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, and who the comic relief characters are, but to be fair, it's not like the original fairy tales were exactly subtle with those distinctions. And as has been said, the animation is still of good quality, and later Disney films would continue that tradition of quality animation. We've already talked about The Little Mermaid's incredible attention to detail that makes it look like the characters are actually underwater. And Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin, though maybe not standouts in the imagery department, still create their own unique atmosphere that works for their own stories. The only imagery I'm not entirely crazy about is Tangled. And it's not because it's computer generated, it's because it just doesn't seem to reflect the sort of reality that I've come to expect from Disney animation. Though, that being said, the sequence with the floating lamps is easily one of the most breathtaking sequences in Disney animation.
So, by and large, while Disney did do a fair amount of sanitizing the story, it's never so much that it's insulting to the audience, and the animation really is great. You can say a lot about Disney, but you can't deny that they really can paint a picture. Wait, where's the song? What? Isn't there supposed to be a song? Apparently not. But there's been a song at the end of every round. Not this one, evidently. No matter, we can make one up. No, singing guy, there doesn't need to be a song at the end of every round. Can't we just let this one go? There is no song about imagery. But there must be. I have a good cue line and everything!
Singing guy, how many times do I have to tell you? There is no song about imagery. Only now there is. As it so often happens, the score we find is tied. And as is often the case here, it's story that will decide whether book maintains its lead, or if a tiebreaker must be found. So Matt, good luck to you. And you. A fitting end to season 2. I'll show them